Hello, and thank you for joining us today here at the J. Ronald Terwilliger Center for Housing Policy. I'm Owen Minot, Senior Policy Analyst for Housing and Infrastructure at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Today, we'll be discussing the Housing Choice Voucher Program, a low-income rental assistance program overseen by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Through the program, public housing authorities provide vouchers to help low-income households afford housing they find in the private market with the aim of reducing housing instability. However, as we'll hear much more about today, the program is less effective than it could be because many landlords decline to participate in the program, citing a variety of challenges and negative experiences. Today, we'll be discussing how to overcome those challenges to increase landlord participation in the voucher program. Just to give a brief outline of our programming today, first, we'll have a short presentation on the voucher program and challenges to landlord participation. Then, we'll have a couple public housing authority leaders join us to dive into their experiences and tell us about successful strategies they've used to improve the program for landlords. If you're watching live today, please do submit any questions you have at any time. You can post them in the chat if you're watching on YouTube, or tweet them to @BPC_bipartisan or using hashtag BPCLive. So to kick us off and help set the stage, Dr. Philip Garbodin will provide an opening presentation. Dr. Garbodin is a professor of affordable housing economics, policy, and planning at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. His work examines how the decisions of landlords, tenants, and developers are shaped by domestic housing policies and how these decisions impact the lives of low-income tenants. He was also a lead researcher for a seminal report prepared for HUD on urban landlords and their experiences with the Housing Choice Voucher Program. So with that, Dr. Garbodin, welcome, and I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, everybody, for having me here today, and thank you for that introduction. I'm very excited to talk about how landlords do or do not choose to participate in the Housing Choice Voucher Program. And I'm also very excited to learn from the other panelists who are doing the work of running voucher programs, recruiting landlords day in and day out. So if possible, I had some slides I wanted to talk about. If we could pull those up, wonderful. So Owen gave a bit of an introduction on the voucher program, and I wanted to just sort of give a little more detail, important context. I'm sure for most of the folks in the audience, this is just a bit of review. But the way the voucher program works is that it serves, broadly speaking, the lowest income families. It is not an entitlement. Indeed, it serves approximately one in four or 1 in 5, depending on how you count, of eligible families. Those families, after usually being on the waiting list for quite some time, are given the opportunity and are issued a voucher. Depending on the specific context, they are largely responsible to secure housing themselves, going out into the private market, just like any other tenant might, and approaching landlords who may or may not be willing to rent to them. Sometimes they're not willing to rent to them for all the usual reasons that a landlord might screen out a tenant, but sometimes, and what we're going to be talking about today, they decide not to rent to them simply because they'll be using a voucher to make their payments. Families in the programs pay 30% of their own income directly to the landlord for housing, and then the Public Housing Authority, with funding via HUD, will pay the difference essentially between what that family can afford and what that landlord charges for rent. Importantly for today's discussion, HUD attempts to limit sort of the inflationary potential of those vouchers by capping the maximum rent that it will allow tenants to live in the program. It's called the fair market rent. Many nuances to how that number is calculated that we don't need to chat about today. Sometimes it's at the metropolitan level, sometimes it's at down to the zip code level. But nonetheless, there's essentially a ceiling for what landlords for what types of units that can participate in the program. And so I'm going to talk broadly about what the research says of why landlords choose not to participate. And then I'm going to talk in some detail about both local and now national attempts to increase participation from landlords and what may or may not work to get that to happen. Next slide, please. All right, so As Owen mentioned, the bulk of what I'll be talking about today comes from a large project, largely funded by HUD, in which myself and a fairly substantial team talked to landlords, in a broad range of cities across the country. We really wanted to hear directly from a random sample of landlords about their experiences in their program. We talked to landlords that were participating in the voucher program and landlords that were not participating in the voucher program. And if you're interested in reading and remarkable amount of detail on this, these programs, there are two reports that are on the screen right there. Urban Landlords and the Voucher Program is available on the HUD website. The other one is available on the Mobility Works website, and I'm happy to share that as well. Okay. So before I start talking about why landlords don't want to participate, I want to talk a bit about why they do want to participate. And whether or not a landlord wants to participate in the voucher program depends heavily on the type of neighborhood that landlord is located in. So in high poverty neighborhoods with a lot of vacancy, neighborhoods with low rents, landlords are very incentivized to take voucher holders. It's essentially guaranteed rent coming directly from the government, often at rates that a market tenant in that community would not be able to afford. But in higher income communities, so-called middle or opportunity neighborhoods, landlords definitely reject, in some cases, the majority of landlords reject voucher holders. The first and most obvious reason why they do that is they want to charge a rent above the fair market rent, right? I mean, no landlord is going to lower their rent simply to accept a voucher holder. If they've set their rent at a rate that they can think they can attract a market tenant, they're going to do that. And so there's been a lot of energy across the country to adjust payment standards, make them more flexible, to essentially widen the pool of landlords who might participate. But even landlords who fall below that payment standards often opt out of the program. And this is where these conversations with landlords became really important. First is that there was large frustration over process delays, right? A landlord accepts a market tenant for their unit. That market tenant will often pay them first and security right then and there. And that market tenant can move in almost immediately and start paying rent. There's a lot of approvals and contractual processes that occur for a voucher tenant that do not occur for a market tenant. And those processes can delay that initial move-in period, anywhere from a couple of weeks to even some landlords are reporting as long as a month, depending on inspection timelines and whatnot. So essentially what that landlord is facing is, do I lose a month of rent or do I rent to a market tenant? And you can see how that calculus doesn't always work out in voucher holders' favor. Second is that in order to participate in the program, all units have to go through what's called a housing quality inspection. Basically, the federal government is not interested in funding unsafe or unsanitary housing, and rightly so. But this means that voucher subsidized units need to pass this inspection. Landlords that we talked to, of course, would always want lower standards, more flexibility, but what they really upset them was what they viewed as capriciousness, right? Things that would pass in one unit would fail in another, and it was very hard for them to predict in advance what particular features would involve a pass on the first round or the delays and costs associated with a failure. The next point is that, like with any other tenants, landlords and voucher tenants often have disagreements about who should pay for repairs, whose fault this and that. Landlords that we spoke to who had participated in the program felt that they expected the PHA to advocate on their behalf, that they were indeed assisting the housing authority with providing this family housing, and they felt, in their perception, that they were not receiving the types of interactions from PHAs as they would have wanted. And of course, it goes without saying that many landlords are concerned about voucher tenants in ways that aren't necessarily backed up by empirical data, worried about issues of property damage, subsequent relocation and so forth. A lot of those are based on stereotypes, but nonetheless, they are actual motivators for landlords of whether or not they will participate. And so it's important to remember when we're talking about this. I think that there's often this perception that landlords are not participating fully out of ignorance. Landlords always are embedded with the networks of other landlords. And when we sought out specifically landlords who were not participating in the voucher program, many of them had direct experience with participation, right? So I think there's a lot that can be done in terms of how we administer that about the voucher program that can make those experiences more positive and mean that landlords are more willing to accept voucher tenants on subsequent units, and indeed perhaps for a wider range of the properties in their portfolio, because of course landlords will sometimes accept in some units and not in others. All right, next slide, please. All right, so what can be done about this? And I'm just going to go through this as a bit of a brainstorm list, but it can help us get thinking about what is being tried. And like everything else, this started as a lot of local innovations. You'll hear from the two other panelists about some of those innovations. And HUD has now implemented a large national study of landlord incentives, testing them out systematically across the country in order to determine which of them are most effective at promoting participation. So this is a bit of a laundry list, but I'll go through it. The first, as I said, money is literally the bottom line here. There's been attempts to raise the fair market rents in the types of neighborhoods where landlords are least likely to accept voucher holders. That can be done directly through fair market rents or through payment standard formulas. That's not a particularly important detail. And other PHAs have attempted simply to offer cash incentives. If you accept a voucher holder, you get a cash incentive of some fixed amount to sort of get introducing new landlords into the program with the direct benefit. Because landlords are often concerned that their units will be damaged, PHAs have set up damage insurance and repair funds that are designed to pay for damages that a tenant might cause in advance. The nice thing about these funds is that they're often much more valuable. They pay than you would think. They don't pay out very much, but they give landlords a lot of security about knowing that if something does go wrong, then they have a recourse. Because of those gaps in payments that I was talking about, PHAs have experiments with bridge payments to cover, between when a voucher tenant leaves a unit and when the next voucher tenant comes in. So there isn't sort of a month of, or even a few weeks of gap there, which can then incentivize the landlord to select another voucher tenant. Starting the clock, essentially starting the rent as soon as the tenant and the landlord agree to occupy the unit. And then sort of backdating the rent while the inspection and the contractual process is going on. And the most intensive version of that is master leasing, right? So a PHA or a municipality could lease a property from a landlord for 10 years and then move voucher holders in and out of it, knowing that it will stay voucher holder permissive for that period. There's been a lot of talk about what can be done with inspections. Can you go to every 2 years if a unit has subsequently passed for brand new units in multifamily developments? If 50% of the units pass, can the others all pass? How do you sort of make it more flexible without, of course, lowering the threshold for secondary housing in the place? There's been probably the most mature of these interventions is simply having someone on staff whose job it is to liaison with landlords, right? To engage them with issues, to talk to them, to recruit them, to go to seminars, pitch the benefits of the voucher program, and also be there for landlords should issues arise. And that can be everything from running workshops to just having a hotline, letting folks call you. Also on the tenant side, we found that having that type of counseling and search support can help tenants communicate with landlords in ways that are most effective and can break down a lot of barriers if you have sort of a search coordinator, a search assistant who's helping in a very direct and hands-on way that tenant find housing. And finally, the most direct approach is to make it illegal for landlords to discriminate against voucher holders if that voucher holder would be otherwise qualified for that unit. This is called source of income discrimination legislation. Many municipalities around the country have adopted that. It has not occurred at a national level. What the data suggests there is that it can improve the lease-up rates of voucher holders to some degree. But of course, if landlords aren't incentivized to participate, there are plenty of ways to get around even the best crafted rule around discrimination. All right, next slide, please. All right. Finally, I just want to talk a bit about, when we talk about incentivizing landlords, what the overall goal here is. So I think the fundamental baseline goal is that we want families who get vouchers to be able to use those vouchers, right? The numbers differ drastically by municipality, but anywhere between 20 and 50% of families who receive vouchers aren't able to use them because they can't find a willing landlord. And that's a problem, right? That's inefficient. It costs everybody money and it hurts that family who now needs to sort of remain on the unsubsidized market. You also want to decrease search time, make it easier for families to find things. Sort of secondary goals is increasing the pool of willing landlords, right? It's called the Housing Choice Voucher Program for a reason. And so if more landlords are willing to participate, we're not talking today about expanding the actual number of vouchers, but even if the number of vouchers stays fixed, more participating landlords means families are better able to optimize their housing, right? The sort of housing bundle, where you're located, what type of housing, and more likely then to benefit from the program. And this goes for units as well as neighborhoods, right? We know vouchers are highly concentrated in particular places, the places where landlords are most incentivized to accept them, and adding more choice to families with these vouchers, assuming they can afford to pay for them, is always a benefit. And so that's sort of the secondary goal of avoiding spatial clustering and promoting neighborhood conditions that best align with that particular family's needs. Beyond that, there's some debate about whether having more landlords per voucher tenant is good or bad, right? If you have big landlords, but they're very high quality, then many tenants might select into those units. But generally speaking, we're in a position now where the program relies on a smaller than ideal pool of landlords to house its families. And so sort of increasing the number of landlords who are participating in the program is ultimately an efficient and positive outcome, most likely in most cases. And finally, we know that a lot of landlords exit the voucher program when a voucher tenant leaves. And so having good, desirable units stay in the program year after year is a benefit to voucher families. And in terms of efficiency, one thing we know is that when voucher families can't find units in the private market, they often rent units in properties funded by the low-income housing tax credit, who are statutorily required to accept voucher holders. That essentially means that unit is being subsidized twice, on both sides, demand and supply. And that's fine, and it works out, and it's a necessary piece of this story. But an ideal scenario would be a voucher program that subsidizes in the purely private market, and the low-income housing tax credit as a very effective housing production tool to create affordable units to families who are unfortunate enough to have a voucher. So that's, I think, something to keep in mind as we go forward with the discussion, is sort of what is the overall goal of getting more landlords to participate. All right, I believe that's my last slide. I think it says the last one is thank you. I'll leave it now to the next presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Garbone. That was really useful context for our discussion. In addition to Philip, on our panel today, we have Michael Johnston, Executive Director of the Cambridge Housing Authority in Massachusetts. And we also have Ivory Matthews, CEO of Home Forward in Portland, Oregon. Thank you both for joining us. Before I get into our questions, I want to remind everyone watching to please submit any questions you have using the live chat on YouTube or Facebook or on Twitter using hashtag BPCLive. We'll try to leave time at the end to get to a few of those questions. And with that, let's dive right into our discussion. So Ivory and Michael, you both have firsthand experience leading organizations that administer housing vouchers. Can you speak a little bit about how your organizations help meet the housing needs of the communities you serve? And either of you feel free to start.
I can start, Owen. Thank you so much, Owen, and also the Bipartisan Policy Center for having this very important discussion today. I'll talk a little bit, just want to say a quick sentence about Home Forward, just to place things in context. We're the largest housing authority in the state of Oregon, serving a little under 12,000 families in our Housing Choice Voucher Program. So to go to the question, we began by recognizing that our services are perhaps the closest that people get to a direct experience with local government. Here at Home Forward, we literally build and we operate, and we also subsidize homes that people live in. So the Housing Choice Voucher Program to us is such a wonderful resource for families facing housing affordability issues. And also at Home Forward, we've been focused for years on ensuring that households are actually able to use the resources when they receive them. And I'm excited to talk in more details about some of those strategies, but we do so much more to serve our community As I mentioned, we own and operate thousands of homes, including more and more supportive housing. We also fund the development of new affordable housing to build and acquire more homes. Our community services team responds to all manners of needs, from nutrition assistance to youth supports to housing stability. And in addition to the thousands of families we subsidize with the vouchers in the private rental market, we administer many emergency rent assistance programs as well, serving not only our families here in the county that that our housing authority is jurisdictionally able to serve. We also do it throughout the state as well. We consult on local jurisdictional efforts to expand our region's housing supports. And then we also, it's also important that that I note that we have a diverse workforce with hundreds of people who serve, the families, and we have, internal support staff, including training development, and to allow us to be able to finance the infrastructure to do all of this wonderful work. Lastly, we're guided by a mission and values that are informed by over 8 decades of experience, and recognizing that housing is not as simple as buildings and rent assistance, is so much more. So looking forward to the rest of the questions.
So I'll jump in. Owen, I want to thank you and the Policy Center for having this discussion. I do want to kind of set the stage a little bit. Cambridge Housing Authority, we've been a traditional housing authority since 1935. We are really no longer a traditional housing authority, just like Home Forward. We operate in a much different environment here in Cambridge. We have a land mass of about 6.3 square miles. City of Cambridge measures at the width about 7 miles long, and the width is about 2 miles. So it's a very small geographical area. We are very dense, population of 118,000 people. We are the number 8 most densest city in the United States. We are Massachusetts, behind Hawaii, Phil, is according to the National Low Income Housing Coalition, we are the number 3 most expensive housing market, with Hawaii coming in at number 1. We have found here in Cambridge, we've had traditional public housing, which we've now moved to Section 8 project-based public housing. We've pretty much moved our entire portfolio, with about 53 public housing units left in the portfolio. We serve about 14,500 households in total between the units we own and our voucher units. We've been an MTW agency, a moving to work agency, since 1996. Bear in mind, the MTW program is HUD's longest running demonstration program in the history of HUD, I think. I don't think they've ever had a demonstration program that's run quite as long as MTW. The city of Cambridge had rent control. When I started here 32 years ago, I was running the voucher program, and we had a very strict rent control ordinance, and that ended in 1995. Had it not been for MTW and the incentives we were able to pull out of our pocket through the MTW program, we probably would have lost a lot of the landlords that we still have today. So that's kind of setting what Cambridge is and a little bit about the city. And just to give you like an idea on the numbers, a 2-bedroom here in Cambridge, the rents have actually dropped a little bit. They've gone down about 3% since last year. So that's good. A 2-bedroom right now, an average rent for a 2-bedroom is $3,700. for a 2-bedroom apartment. I saw on Phil's slides, he had some, I think Brentwood, I think that might be California. I was thinking, wow, those are good prices. I wish we had those here in Cambridge. So that sets up kind of what we are and what we're dealing with here in Cambridge.
Thank you both for that background. So landlords across the country, as we've heard, have highlighted challenging experiences with the housing voucher program that prevent them from accepting these vouchers. And I'm curious to hear about your own experiences. Ivory, let's start with you. In your career, you have served communities in both Oregon and South Carolina, two very different states. To what extent has the reluctance of landlords to accept vouchers been a problem in these communities? And how has it affected voucher holders in their housing search? And what do you see as the main reasons landlords are hesitant to accept vouchers?
Thank you, Owen. So, any answer to this question has to begin by debunking the myths of the low-income problem tenant. We support in-house people, and whether rich or poor, people sometimes struggle. We know that people can thrive, but we also know that success comes in many different forms. So educating about stereotypes is important to us. And at the same time, we have acknowledged the service that our landlord community provides to tenants receiving rent assistance and the ways that the Housing Choice Voucher Program relies on the private rental market. So I'm going to take, for example, source of income discrimination is a big issue here. We all accept that fair housing prevents discrimination based on race, gender, religion, and national origin, to name just a few. But we know that the omission of source of income is a big one. And given what we know about race and gender and poverty, it is potentially a loophole to fair housing laws. That's the first thing that comes to mind when comparing South Carolina to Oregon. Oregon has extended the protection of source of income, ensuring that it is not illegal to discriminate against voucher holders. South Carolina has not taken this step, and it shifts the power imbalance towards rejection of voucher holders. However, we also know that even states like Oregon, with these laws, still have enforcement issues. We know this to be the case because a recent fair housing study that was just released in July of 2020 by the Fair Housing Council of Oregon showed extensive discrimination against voucher holders. So the voucher holders were shown more expensive housing. They were told they aren't sure if Section 8 was accepted and were quoted different terms and conditions. They were also subjected to upsetting and harmful questions about their lifestyle. So it isn't just enough to pass a law with a particular language. That matters, but follow-up and enforcement also matters too. And, we supported the creation of a risk mitigation pool to further reduce landlords' concerns. So, and that pool has been certainly a positive to partnering with our landlords, and also local support of housing first approaches, supportive services, staffing supports, and other program specifics are things that we included in our voucher program to support our landlords. And when we discuss this topic, we speak, from experience. As the housing authority, we often are also the landlord on the other side of the voucher program as well, or a voucher arrangement. So we know that usually it's about affordability and owners who have concerns about families who cannot afford the rent. So our job as housers, regardless of the state that we live in, is to educate our owners about how voucher increase affordability and to continue to advocate for more long-term and emergency rent assistance to address that affordability issue.
Thank you. And Michael, I want to turn that over to you. In Cambridge, to what extent has the reluctance of landlords to accept vouchers been a problem? And what do you see as the main reasons landlords have been hesitant, if they have been?
It's money. Landlords want, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, a 2-bedroom average rent for a 2-bedroom is $3,700. That's what they're looking for. We have 2 very well-known colleges here in the city of Cambridge. We have MIT on one end of the city, we have Harvard on the other end of the city. And you can get a few grad students in a 3-bedroom apartment, each paying $1,500 or $2,000 a piece. And the landlord is basically getting what they want. I mean, here in Cambridge, again, we're dealing with two different marketplaces, and you are dealing with MTW agencies. And we've chose here in Cambridge, how do we increase the project basing? And I know project basing for a lot of the advocates is taboo. By project basing, you're holding people in a unit. You're creating, not giving them that mobility into an opportunity area. Cambridge is an opportunity area. The surrounding metropolitan Boston area is an opportunity area. And we have, pretty much hit about 55% of our voucher portfolio is now project-based. And the rationale for that is I can basically control how many housing units I have available for the 21,000 people that are sitting on our waiting list right now. So for us, it's really been about the project basing. But on top of that, how do you get the mom and pop landlords to come back to the voucher program? And in 2018, we had a success rate in Cambridge of about 32% of our voucher holders were living in Cambridge. The rest, and this is the mobile voucher holders, so 32% of our mobile voucher holders were residing in the city of Cambridge. The others had gone out to less expensive suburban communities. And we really wanted to turn that around. And we adopted the small area FMRs. And that allowed us to get closer. We're still not at these fair market rents, but it allowed us to get closer. And as of last year, we're up to 47%. So we've been able to claw our way back from 32% to 47%. So it's really a money issue here in Cambridge. It's how do you show the landlords that the program can compete with the grad students and the other students? Back when Quora was enacted and they did away with security, basically last month's rents and security deposits for damages, that was crazy. The voucher program is dealing with our most vulnerable population, right? We're dealing with the folks, basically for us, almost the entire 21,000 people on our waiting list are below 30% of AMI. So now you're telling them, well, we're going to give you this piece of paper that you waited for 6 years for. Here it is. And by the way, when you find your unit, you're going to have to come up with $3,700 security deposit and a $3,700 last month rent. Housing authorities have to figure out how do you cover that. And MTW agencies like Home Forward or Cambridge Housing Authority, we can do that, right? We have that luxury, that ability, and that has really helped. In our emergency housing voucher allocation, where HUD has actually given funds to pay for some of this stuff, you can pay landlords to participate, you can pay incentive fees, you can pay broker fees, because the bottom line is HUD realizes that to make this program work in the society we have, you've got to figure out how to fund these extra fees. And it really is about the money. And one more thing I would say, Owen, before I shut up, is the other problem, I was in the weeds for a long time, sitting across the table, doing briefings for Section 8 voucher people coming in off the waiting list. And one of the things, the program is complicated. I could bring in 25 people to do a briefing for. And by the end of my briefing, I could look around the room and I could kind of figure out which 10 people, what 50% would not be able to use their voucher. And I could figure out why, right? They couldn't really grasp the concept of the voucher. They didn't have the ability to go out and sell themselves to a landlord. I used to tell them, and hopefully this is okay to say, but I used to tell them, you have to pretend you're a shoe salesman, right? You have to pretend you are selling shoes, and you want the landlord to believe that you are the best shoe for that landlord, right? You and your family. And people have a hard time doing that. And, you know, somehow we've lost the fact that this program houses our most vulnerable, right? And it is a very hard program for our most vulnerable to navigate. Thank you.
So Ivory and Michael, I want to stay with you two for just another minute. We've invited you two to join us because your organizations have been leaders in implementing strategies to make the voucher program more attractive to landlords. So could you share a little bit more about why this has been a priority for you, what strategies you've pursued, and what has worked?
I'll start, and I'm going to use one of Michael's words. I'm going to get a little bit into the weeds. I too, you know, working in this business for 20 years, I've have spent some of my tenure working in the weeds. So, but first of all, you know, one of the things that we do is we have a dedicated housing search advocate who works closely with families, especially those with particular barriers or needs. As Michael stated, just getting people a good grasp and an education around how they can be successful in locating a house or unit. We also have dedicated landlord services teams that are available to answer questions that owners might have about the program or a household. So this has certainly been, it streamlined the process, it expedites, it gives the landlord that one-on-one personal touch to making sure that they completely understand the program as well. And also our service coordinators receive training that helps them understand the difficulties households face leasing our housing, leasing in our housing market. We have a variety of people with various barriers and needs, and it's a very diverse community. And so, but we're fortunate enough to have those service coordinators with those skill sets and training to be able to help provide that extra human touch to our families. And finally, as we see shifts in our populations or demographics, we also have dedicated additional staff resources to issues like processing reasonable accommodations or accessing data, to responding to other supports and housing needs. We also, to break down some of our additional barriers that families might face, we, with our moving to work flexibilities, we have the flexibility to use some of our funds, and we do use our funds in these ways. We fund an expungement clinic with a local public defender that helps justice-involved households prepare for leasing. We also fund the Community Alliance of Tenants to provide renters education classes, which makes households eligible for security deposit financial assistance, which is huge. We pay incentives to landlords who are new to the program to invite a broader participation. We know that landlords are an essential part of this program, and we want to do as much as we can to incentivize those landlords. We provide access to flexible rent assistance to resolve any type of bad debt, to pay application fees, or otherwise resolve barriers. This includes targeted like security deposit assistance also to our VASH or veterans eligible households as well. Finally, I will add that in our housing choice voucher, our housing choice voucher program looks a little bit different. And I'll mention again, just due to our moving to work flexibilities, we can customize it to make sure that it is most beneficial to the families we serve. So what we've done is we have 9 different payment standards throughout our county in 9 different zones. And the reason why we do this is because it gives a better match to the market. So owners should not have to reduce their rents to lease to the voucher holders. We have dramatically increased our payment standards within each zone to make sure that we do the best that we could possibly do to keep up with the increases in market. We've sped up our inspections with self-certifications, particularly when there are minor issues. We don't want to hold that unit up for being available to the family, so we've sped that process up. And we're also allowing self-certification of income for families as well. All of these financial investments pale in comparison to the overall size of our voucher program. And it certainly is tremendously impactful to access, leasing, and retention. This is, there's certainly plenty more that fits under our housing first model, but these are just a few handful of approaches we're taking on behalf of the family searching for homes. And I will also add, we certainly need more vouchers throughout our communities and our country. And we'll keep advocating to Congress for those resources. For now, we are doing our part to ensure that families can use the resources we have.
So again, I guess, Ivory is representing an MTW agency, and I'm representing an MTW agency, and we're on two sides of the country, and we have very dramatic differences in how we run our program, because MTW allows you to run your program for your community the way that you can tailor your programs to meet the needs of the community that you reside in. Here in Cambridge, again, we've really pushed the project basing. We have pushed partnerships with various agencies. A couple of HUD staffers reached out to me and said, "Oh, you have to mention your sponsor-based voucher program," which we years ago we started, instead of issuing vouchers to individuals, we chose to issue vouchers to sponsors, to organizations. For instance, Transition House here in Cambridge, which is a domestic violence shelter. Y2Y is a youth shelter in Harvard Square. Bridge Over Troubled Water is another youth shelter. And we issue those vouchers to these sponsors so that they can use their good name and they can go out and rent an apartment, and they allow one of their participants to use that apartment, to use that voucher, to start to gain housing history, to start to gain, get their feet back underneath of them and get themselves ready to move forward. In the Transition House model, we've actually taken it a step further, and we now call it Pathways to Permanent Housing, where folks that come out of domestic violence can start out with a sponsor-based voucher, and then after so many months, they can actually transition into a mobile voucher, and they can actually take over the lease and the voucher for that unit. So again, for us, it's really the partnerships of working with the different populations that we have. With Transition House, we've been able to pay for, and we have a domestic violence counselor that works with our voucher participants, with our incoming applicants. People come in to apply for emergency status here at Cambridge. We do have an emergency preference for people. One of those is for domestic violence. And to be honest with you, the rules and how do you talk to people with domestic violence, and that it requires a specialized kind of a dialogue and a specialized person to do that. And we've chose, it's easier to have somebody from the outside. Money, Ivory talked about the number of payment standards that they use throughout their county. Here in the city of Cambridge, again, 6.3 square miles, we have 5 zip codes, and each zip code has its own set of payment standards across the board, from the studios up to 5 bedrooms. And the small area FMRs are priced out so that in the affluent neighborhoods in Cambridge, there's a way for people to get into these neighborhoods, and people are getting back into these neighborhoods. The landlord payments, the security deposits, the incentives, all of that is really, it's almost necessary to run a program like the voucher program here in the eastern side of the country. And the last thing, Ivory ended up with saying we need more vouchers. I agree 100% with that. Here in New England, we need more affordable housing, right? And you have to define affordable housing. I noticed in Philip's slides, you don't want to cross the low-income housing tax credit with vouchers, but my folks, the 21,000 people that I have on my waiting list, can't afford a low-income housing tax credit unit, right? So all these low-income housing tax credit units that are getting built that people are calling affordable, I've got 21,000 people that can't rent them because unless they get a voucher, it's unaffordable for them. So here in New England, here in this side of the country, it is a necessary evil, and we have used the low-income housing tax credit. In full disclosure to we have gone through about 3/4 of our portfolio, and we have done some drastic renovations, substantial renovations that will make our housing sustainable for the next 30, 40, 50 years. And pretty proud of that. So thank you.
Great. Okay. Philip, I want to bring you back in because you've spoken to a lot of PHA leaders, and I know you touched on this a bit in your presentation, but I was wondering if you could highlight any specific examples of PHAs using strategies to make the voucher program more attractive to landlords that were particularly successful.
Yes, and before I answer that, I just, it's very exciting to be on this panel because, of the 5 PHAs that are doing the most exciting work nationally on these issues, we have two direct experts on here today. So, I think there's a lot of really interesting local experimenting happening around the country, and it's maybe I'm a bit old school insofar as there's still a lot of evaluation to be done to understand which of these are most effective, but many of the things we've already talked about today have very promising preliminary findings and very promising opening ideas. To talk a bit about this sort of money talks question, we have this fundamental, we had for many years a fundamental problem with a rent ceiling that wasn't customized to local conditions within a metropolitan area, right? So a city like Cambridge needs to have a higher rent ceiling than other municipalities nearby. And for quite a while, that wasn't possible. So one of the big major changes that was made to the program are these small area fair market rents that allow for high price zip codes to have a higher ceiling than low price zip codes. You're still sort of over the metro area, still the same percentage of eligible units, but you're ensuring that all the eligible units aren't in low rent areas and there are no eligible units in high rent areas. Many PHAs, and I'm thinking of Washington, D.C. As an example here, have taken that a step further and used I believe this was mentioned about Cambridge, have used their own ability to adjust, basically tweak the fair market rent, although some of these are more significant than what you would call tweak, differentially, again, by zip codes. So really sort of double down on the places where landlords are most resistant and really go at increasing those rent ceilings. And DC, I'm forgetting the exact number, but it has gone up really substantially. We're not talking about plus or minus 5% here. We're talking, 40% increases, which MTW authority and of course a lot of fundraising, funding creativity allow you to do, and that dramatically improves the scenario. We talk in our research, landlords always have in mind what we call the counterfactual tenant, the person who they would rent to and what that person could pay if not a voucher tenant, right? And so in places where that person is wealthy and able to pay a lot of rent, they'll go that direction. And never voucher program. I think the other piece that hasn't been talked about as much, though, is mentioned as well, are these damage pools, right? And different PHAs are structured different ways, but basically these are pots of money that if a tenant creates damage above the security deposit and it's deemed to be the tenant's fault, the PHA will help make that landlord whole again. These programs have sort of come up in various ways across the country. What's so great about those, and this gets to a couple comments ago, is it doesn't pretend that landlords don't hold the stereotype, right? That voucher tenants are going to damage their units, but it recognizes that actually most voucher tenants do not damage units. You don't need a huge amount of money to start one of these pools. You need a fairly modest amount of money because, so when things happen, they happen fairly rarely, right? But for the landlords to have that sort of sense of security that, I don't know what this voucher tenants do. I have preconceived notions about voucher tenants and how they're going to act in my units. So if the PHA is telling me they'll cover a portion of that risk, I'm much more likely to do that. And then they'll have sort of the experiential aspect of, oh, this voucher tenant is fine and has now leased my unit for 7 years, which is something that most market tenants don't do or can't afford to do in most contexts. And you have that benefit. And so the damage pools can do a lot to sort of allay the concerns while also not ending up being that expensive compared to the cost of the voucher program. And the third thing I mentioned is there's been experiments, Seattle is coming to mind as an example, in intense housing counseling, right? Sort of helping the tenants sell, was it shoes? That was the example that was mentioned earlier, sell those shoes, right? And the way that funding for housing authorities is currently set up means that most housing authorities simply don't have the resources to provide, intensive counseling for each one of their families with a voucher. The program's complicated, there's a lot of moving parts. And so insofar as more money can be added to the program, we need to add more vouchers. That almost goes without saying, but we also need to add more support for public housing authorities to support tenants in their housing searches, in their housing needs, in all of those types of things. And those programs have been incredibly effective at achieving higher lease-up rates at higher quality units, a more diverse set of areas across a metropolitan area, all of those types of pieces. So those are the three I would highlight quickly.
Great. I want to also turn to federal policy and what the federal government can do. So Michael, you serve on the board of the Public Housing Authorities Directors Association. So I'm sure you've had a lot of conversations about the federal government's role with other PHA leaders. And based on your experiences and discussions with other leaders, is there anything the federal government administratively or at HUD or legislatively in Congress, is there anything the federal government can do to help PHAs make vouchers more attractive to landlords?
Moving to work, expand the program, do it as a again, it's the longest running demonstration program in HUD's history. We've added new cohorts into the MTW program, but they are very limited in what they can do. A lot of what we have done in Cambridge has been adopted in the regulations that HUD uses now to run the voucher program. To kind of get on Phillips, we are, to his point on the damage provisions, over the last 2 years, we've only paid damages for 102 units, totaling about I think it was $140,000, right? So in 2 years, considering the turnover that we have in our voucher program, that is actually a very small amount of money. And it just gives landlords that, my son is a grad student. I can tell you the parties he's had in his apartment, and I'm like, oh my God, I feel so bad for your landlord. But honestly, MTW, expand MTW. We're funded through a block grant. All of these programs that we do are funded out of the. Basically, the more we can save, the more efficient we can run our other programs, the more efficient we can administer as a housing authority. We have more cash to leverage for these other activities. And I just MTW. And I hear it at FADA, I hear it at CLAFA, and the MTW, continuum also. So it's MTW.
Great. Okay. I want to make sure we get to some of our audience questions. So one question we have is, have you seen any examples of homeowners associations or gated communities banning voucher holders? And if so, how do you combat that? Has anyone experienced that?
We do not have any gated communities here in Cambridge. And again, I think Massachusetts is, we have source of income, discrimination on the books. But in Massachusetts, all you really have to do is put the market rate for your apartment in the ad, and you pretty much exclude a lot of your voucher holders.
I will say, having worked on the East Coast in South Carolina, having worked in the state of Ohio, now here in Oregon, and just, knowing from my colleagues, hearing stories from my colleagues across the country, there is NIMBYism not in my backyard that exists in every community. And I think one of the things that we who are in this business of helping our voucher holders be successful is that we continue to the greatest extent to educate our communities. So anytime NIMBYism creeps up in conversations, and NIMBYism can look and come in many different forms, we always, go above and beyond to have those conversations and exchanges with people to educate them about, about their viewpoints, and in most cases to let them know that sometimes what they are wanting to do is against state law, is against local laws. And so yeah, this is kind of one of the things that we face, but it still doesn't stop us from doing our work.
Great. Okay. And we only have a couple minutes left, but I just wanted to highlight that in turning it back to federal policy. In the last Congress, there was bipartisan legislation introduced that did not pass that was intended to improve the voucher program for landlords. So it included incentives for PHAs to retain landlord liaisons on staff, as well as greater flexibility for inspections and incentives for landlords to participate in the program. Do you all think something, just really briefly, do you all think something that would be helpful? And if Congress was to pass a program like this, or a reform to the program, is there any single measure that you would really focus on for that legislation?
So I'm going to just jump in real quick. And one of the problems right now with Congress pushing for legislation is the funding for that legislation, right? It's one thing to say, this is a great program. We think this is a great program. So having, a landlord liaison on staff, great idea. I think that's a wonderful idea, but it has to be funded, right? I worry, I keep seeing more and more things coming out of Congress, out of HUD, that really programs that we have to do are not actually us, because we're MTW, but other housing authorities have to abide by this, but they're not funded for it.
Okay, thank you. Well, that is all the time we have, but this was a really fruitful conversation. Thank you so much for joining us. Enhancing the impact of the voucher program and housing affordability more broadly is a focus of the Terwilliger Center here at BPC. So if this event was of interest to you, please go to our website and check out our work. Thank you again to the panelists and to everyone in the audience joining us today, and take care.
Thank you so much.